of feedback we get. Part of this as well, on your point on the educational stuff, is that with HIS, I'm looking at creating like short bite-sized explainer videos on just random stuff as part of the HIS process but that's directed more towards a clinician perspective.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I think part of some of what we'll be doing here would be trying to dig out or tease out stuff that clinicians could be better at, etc.
Yeah.
Right. Hi, Helena. Are we okay? All right, we're live, but we can just chill out for a bit and wait for a few more people to stream in. Let me see what else I have to touch on. Yeah, so part of the themes that we also want to touch on would be things like the Australian context. So like with Helena, your role in Macquarie, etc. And I think I've started. Can people hear me, Leah? Oh, okay. All right, cool. They only can hear the card. That's fine. Okay. All right. I guess we just can chill out for a bit. How's everyone's days been? I know that Helena, you just came from a meeting.
I've been back to back all day, but that's okay. All good stuff. I just got off a meeting with 10 of our PhD students. We have group huddles all the time, and they're doing amazing things. So it was a really inspiring meeting, listening to the fantastic work that they're doing.
Just a side note, but you're a bit low on my end, Helena. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'll speak louder.
All right, cool. Syncing for YouTube. Hello. Thanks everyone for tuning in to our first episode of The Pacemaker. So it's Mami's new sort of series dedicated to humanizing the healthcare innovation process, and also a bit of research translation as well. Throughout this whole new pilot webinar series, we'll be talking to the folks who have been there, done that, and also still continue to do so. Before I start, in the spirit of reconciliation, Mami would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and the connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today, or if you're tuning in today as well. I also like to thank our partners and funders for Mami. They've been with us from the start, so thank you very much. Monash Engineering, the Monash Institute of Medical Engineering, and Monash Partners as well. So joining us here today have been two people who've been supporting us from pretty much close to a year now, practically the beginning. Today I have Professor Ian Cooke with me. He is a professor fellow over at the University of Melbourne. And also he is a current research translation advisor at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health, and also holds appointment at Monash University teaching the Master of Biotech course, and also facilitating the M2 MedTech Community of Practice initiative going on in Monash at the moment. He has held previous appointments, including CEO of the CRC for mental health, along with various sort of research commercialization activities within the biotech industry. We also have Professor Helena Teede. Professor Helena Teede is an internationally renowned endocrinologist and expert in women's health. She is the co-director of Monash Institute of Medical Engineering. I'll call that mine for now. And also director for Monash Partners and the Monash Center for Health Research and Implementation. So thank you, Ian and Helena, for joining us here today. Today we'll be exploring just a bit about your respective journeys, some tidbits about healthcare innovation. We're going to make this as casual as possible and as chilled out as possible. It's 5:30 in the evening, so it's a nice time for tea. So, so feel free to jump in and be a really sort of casual back and forth. And probably for most of the people listening, when you were like roughly at my age, early 20s, did you ever think that you would end up where you are right now? I think I'll just start with, I'd say, Ian.
Okay. So I think when I was your age in early 20s, I was probably on my 4th PhD project because they kept on failing. Did I expect to be working in an area in relation to translational research in sort of biomedical area? No, I was a science student, sort of like majored in physics and zoology. That's what I liked. I was interested in animal behaviour, and my original goal was to be a marine biologist because that would give me an excuse to hang out on boats and by the beach. I had no intention of ever working in anything that looked like an office. I did zoology for honours rather than physics because I couldn't see myself spending all of my time in front of the sorts of instrumentation that Melbourne University Physics specialised in. So there was a lot of nuclear physics, experimental physics work. Zoology had boats, so that's where I went.
How long was your hair in?
It was a little bit longer than it is now, actually. So I'm going back to what it was. It was not as long as some of my colleagues who ended up in very esteemed positions at my age and haven't actually cut their hair or their beards since they were PhD students.
At risk of dating you, Ian, is that in the 70s or 80s?
That was the 70s, yes.
Got it.
So I'm 64,
Right.
so you can work backwards. And so things just evolved. I got into neuroscience because that was, in those days, neuroscientists were biologists who understood how to use physics and instrumentation, because often you had to build your own instruments to stick electrodes into cells. And so I got into that. I actually discovered I like sitting in front of an instrument with an electrode stuck in a nerve cell. And that's really where it all started. And I went from there. I ended up finishing a PhD. Finally, I got one that worked, and then went to the US. And I was actually always interested in doing things that were sort of so-called practical. And I don't know, these days we call it translational, but I was interested in research that had an impact beyond just an academic publication. And I postdoced at Bell Laboratories, which was the research laboratories of AT&T, which was then the second largest company in the world, largest private research organisation. And I studied in this somewhat bizarre campus in New Jersey, which was made entirely of metal. So all of the inside of all the buildings was made of metal. I studied learning in slugs, surrounded by physicists and engineers and God knows what else. So that's, I guess, what started me. And then, I pursued a conventional academic route. The one positive decision I made about my career was to never depend upon a research grant for my salary once I'd finished my postdoctoral fellowships.
So I guess there was a point where you were starting to look at, bench to bedside. And before we actually talk about that journey, I'm interested in, Helena, how your journey has come along past few, 20, 15 years as well.
Oh no, I was just doing my PhD the other day. Look, I think there are people who plan their careers, and I was not one of them. I've never actually had an ambition to be someone. Very much like Ian, my primary driver is impact. And for me, it's always been critical to know that if you want to solve a problem, you have to understand the problem from the end user's perspective. And in fact, the older and the wiser you get as an expert, the more and more you know about less and less, until you know everything about nothing. And the problem with that is our experts are often leading the problem ideation and therefore starting to develop the solutions. But really, we don't understand the problems that we're necessarily trying to solve into the solutions. So for me, it's always been about really understanding in a very gritty, pragmatic way what the problems are, which means you need all the stakeholders in the room to be able to even go in the direction of what a solution would look like. And that can be an incredibly diverse journey because it can take you in all different directions. So when I started my career, it was about healthcare impact and it was about direct healthcare delivery. So I was going to be a nurse, but it was a little while ago. And I discovered that actually I probably could try medicine first. So I did and loved it and haven't looked back. Incredible privilege to do what I do. I go to work every day and nearly every day I help a large number of people. When I go home knowing I didn't do it for a shareholder or for a boss, I just get the privilege of helping people. And I've always been able to say, I would do what I did whether people paid me or not. So Ian's always not been dependent on research grant. Mine's always been do things that you would do whether you were paid or not. And that is a real privilege. I did my medical degree. Then I wanted diversity of the career because I get obviously. So I went on to do a specialty training in probably the most diverse specialty. Endocrine is every organ of the body, and it's every age span, and it's really fascinating. It's always the thickest part of a medical textbook. A lot of physiology, really fascinating. So I did endocrinology, and I studied under an absolute doyen who was a fantastic role model, Henry Berger. And after my during my PhD, actually just before my PhD, I went and did a lot. I've travelled all my life and quite a bit of volunteer work. And I took a year off and backpacked to all sorts of places that, that had no market economy, and traveled on the back of trucks and slept on floors and did all those important things. Didn't quite go to the beach with long hair and never studied slugs, Ian, but had an amazing life of travel all my life. And then got married along the way, and I've had 2 beautiful children. Fantastic experience. Parenting, very challenging. But after my PhD, I settled down and I got an NHRC fellowship, which was terrific. But I was then juggling 2 young children. I have an academic clinical husband, a very busy role, and I had a clinical leadership role as well as my research, and I thought that was probably enough. But then I was tapped on the shoulder by someone who said, we're going to run a leadership training program with you. Leadership role comes up where you can see that you could do that, you should grab it. And so I have done things in my life I would never have done. I've gone for president roles of national and international societies. I've knocked on the door of health ministers and prime ministers, and I've met with them. And I've engaged people right from literally at the coalface through to really influential positions, and done some really exciting things where I bring great people together to do really big picture stuff. That's a bit of a nutshell.
I think that's really cool, Helena, because you touched on a bit on the notion of getting tapped on the shoulder. I've cheated a bit because, Ian, I've talked to you about this before. And when you were first starting your role as the CEO of the Mental Health CRC, you mentioned you being tapped on the shoulder as well. And both of you have this sort of passion for like tangible impact in the world. I'm interested in that sort of, that narrative where there was a point where you didn't see yourself in a specific light, and there was a defining moment where someone touched you on the shoulder and you began to, see the possibilities. I'm interested, Ian, in how that felt for you personally first.
I think it's not totally out of the blue. Well, the tap is, but the pre-adaptation is not. So, I mean, it's happened to me more than once. It's happened to be 3, yeah. And, various people have created jobs for me, people I've worked with, people I've taught, people I really haven't known at all. But it's come about. Let me give you some examples. I had a role in a consulting firm called Foresight Associates, which was started and still operates. It was started by 4 very special people: Gus Nossel, John Stocker, Graham Mitchell, and David Pennington. And I got a call out of the blue from David Pennington to ask me what I wanted to do with my life and maybe come and have a chat. And I went to Foresight on essentially a 1 day a week gig for about 5 years. At that time, I was Associate Director of the Burnett Institute. Now that came about through a dinner party at home with some of my wife's friends when they were doing their MBA. And one of her friends from her MBA then went to work with JB Weir, which became Goldman Sachs. And they set up a private equity firm, and they engaged Foresight as the advisors to that private equity firm, and they've been running it for about a year as their advisors, and they needed someone to actually do their analysis and write reports. And someone mentioned someone, and that's how I got that call. That was the sort of thing I was looking to do. And I always thought they'd be a great group to work with. I knew all about them, but I didn't know how to get in touch with them.
Yeah.
So, you know, it wasn't that I hadn't thought of, so yes, I was prepared because I had an MBA at that stage, and I had half a Master IP Law course completed, which I'd done in the course of other things. So there's a bit of always, yeah, you come to a pathway and something happens and you can take a different route because to a certain extent you're prepared. So it's not as if I hadn't thought about doing some of those things, but you know, the opportunity came up because of circumstances that I didn't necessarily control. Same when I ended up, you know, a colleague of mine who might be a good person to speak to you at some stage is Dan Grant, who now runs MTP Connect. So Dan was a PhD student at Monash when I was a postdoc in the old Centre for Early Human Development, and then his career went in various directions, and mine went another, and I actually advised Dan about doing his MBA many, many years ago. But there was a time before I was sort of CEO of the CRC for mental health. I was actually the CEO designate of a different neuroscience CEO, which I was looking to put together with a guy named Steve Petra, and it was going to be around epilepsy and pain, which is something I'd worked on because, again, through circumstance, I got a job as running a Monash spin-out that was focused on pain medicine. We got our CRC bid to the final interview stage, and we lost out to the CRC for mental health. And I'd forgotten all about it. And then a year later, they needed a new CEO. Dan was on their board, and so he encouraged me to apply. So you get the opportunity, but you do actually have to put in a bit of the groundwork beforehand because you have at least an interest.
Yeah.
As you might be wanting to do. And that might simply be reading in the area, becoming conversant in it. And I keep saying to the students I teach at Monash this time, and when I last taught at Monash, 10 years ago, follow the things you like to gossip about. Put some time and effort into learning other stuff so you can have a conversation about anything other than just what you're doing in your day-to-day work. Because that's where your opportunity is just as likely to come. Be interested in other things, be interested in other people, and be interesting.
I need to stop us there for a moment because apparently there's technical issues with the stream.
Okay.
Leah, if you're going to restart it,